In 2019, the conservative journalist Ben Shapiro published a polemic called The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. Shapiro positions the West and its greatness in science, human rights, democracy, nationhood, and individualism as being downstream from Athens and Jerusalem, these two ancient cities responsible for Judaism, Christianity, natural law, Aristotle, and Plato. This book was published in a time of great societal upheaval in the United States, with campus culture diverting into censorship and cancel culture. Aware of this, Ben Shapiro combines his usual small government approach with American conservatism, with a historical look at the West, and gives a full-hearted defense of it. Shapiro's book is a bit dated now, but it hints at a genuine perception held by many about the importance of Jerusalem and Athens to the West. To quote Shapiro, "Jerusalem brought the heavens down to earth. Athens' elevation of reason would launch mankind towards the stars." Shapiro is clearly charmed by the legacy left by Aristotle and Judaism and sees them as critical to a strong West. Denying the importance of Athens and Jerusalem to Western civilization is foolish, and I will not do it. I agree with Ben Shapiro that the West is great and worth fighting for. However, I take issue with his rosy and idealistic view of what being Western means. Sure, the West has given us Christianity, scientific accomplishments, Athenian philosophy, and high legal standards. There are other ideas, states, and practices that are thoroughly Western but often stand in opposition to Athens and Jerusalem. Today, it's common for public intellectuals and activists to use terms such as Western values, especially in diplomacy and foreign affairs. We can certainly see the European Union and NATO promoting this perception of a West unified by Enlightenment-ish values, or as Ben Shapiro would argue, the Judeo-Christian and Aristotelian traditions. Here, I will challenge Ben Shapiro's positioning of a West founded on Athens and Jerusalem. Western civilization, as I argue here, was also founded and shaped by Sparta, Germanic tribes, the Celtics, general Hellenization, and the Roman Empire. In successive two blocks of medieval Christendom, the Latin West and the so-called Byzantine Commonwealth preserved antiquity and eventually laid the foundations for the West we know today. Events such as the Reformation, the Italian Renaissance, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars crystallized and at times challenged what it means to be truly Western. I will argue the West has always been characterized by disagreement and difference, and that Athens and Jerusalem, as per Shapiro's framework, are not the trunk of the tree, but rather the branches. Overall, I deconstruct the perception of Western values. By no means do I seek to attack the West. This is my civilization, and I certainly take an intense degree of pride in being a Westerner. There are absolutely people who do seek to subvert the West, often attack aspects of it, like Christianity. That's not my goal here either. I want to portray the West as it has been over time, by drawing not only on philosophy and theology, but also social, political, and military history. We can certainly love and defend the West without resorting to cliches about Western values or by ignoring the intellectual diversity existing throughout Europe, North America, and the South Pacific. But for now, it's time to uncover why the West is far more than Athens and Jerusalem. I'm Madeline Rose Jones, and I discuss history, literature, and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. Attempts to define Western civilization were prone to debate and at times scorn. Question: what Western civilization is comes with many different answers. So, here is mine. The West is defined as the peoples, ideas, traditions, languages, and stories coming from Europe. This includes contemporary nation-states such as Turkey and Russia, but also lands with heavy ethnic and ideological ties to Europe, like Australia and the United States of America. Countries with Western-like aspirations, such as Taiwan and Armenia, are in the greater sphere, but are certainly in dialogue with what being Western means. Other definitions of Western civilization certainly exist. Some are entirely racial, focused on language or on historical processes like the Enlightenment. My definition views the West as a combination of different factors. I'm also cautious about prescribing such a wide net of Western civilization that it covers frankly too many countries, events, and places. Exclusion, I must say, is a reality and something that must be done. We should also consider what being non-Western means. And that brings in various complications and debates, but I will state that simply being secular, Christian, democratic, first world, or good with human rights is not enough to be Western. Nigeria, China, Uganda, Saudi Arabia, and Malaysia certainly have some of these elements, but do not have sufficient of a Western presence for me to argue otherwise. Granted, the answer Ben Shapiro gives is vastly different. To him, the West is primarily about ideas, rather than a solid ethnic bloc. This matches the framework given by other classical liberals and conservatives in the past years, such as James Lindsay, Constantine Kissin, and Claire Lemon from Quillette. Western civilization can only triumph if the ideas at their core are worth fighting for. My definition, meanwhile, is at the crossroads between geography, ethnicity, and language. I am more interested in the people behind the ideas rather than the ideas themselves, but I certainly do not intend to create a parallel between myself and Shapiro. There is no denying the influence of certain religions and philosophies, and it is completely reasonable to point out the dominance of Christianity and Aristotle within the West, where I diverge with Shapiro, so I view the West as existing outside Athens and Jerusalem, which I will illustrate here. Western civilization as a term is quite modern in retrospect and came about in a time of globalization, empire, and international commerce. As writers such as Edward Said have argued, our ideas of the Occident and what being Western means come from engagement with the Orient or the East. But that doesn't mean Western civilization is new or an invention. Since antiquity, various strands of Europe have embarked on civilization-related activities like law, art, poetry, philosophy, diplomacy, agriculture, and technology. These cultures may not have all seen themselves as European or Westerners, but they did vary. Ben Shapiro references Athens quite often in his book, and of course, Athens is critical to any ancient historian seeking to understand the Mediterranean. It was Athens where contributions to democracy, philosophy, and technology came about. The Olympics is also important too. However, there is far more to the ancient Mediterranean and, well, Europe than Athens. Take ancient Greece. Athens was a powerful city-state, particularly between the 5th and the 4th centuries BC. But there were other city-states, kingdoms, and rulers. Alexander the Great, as well as Macedonia, Corinth, Sparta, Crete, and Thebes. After Alexander the Great, we see Hellenism continue to develop with the Parthian and Seleucid empires in places such as Palmyra and Egypt. In fact, many of the ruling dynasties I've mentioned contradicts Athens and in fact challenged her. The best example is obviously Sparta. This was a heavily militarized society which differed from Athens in several ways. For one, Sparta's military edge and warlike nature proved a powerful contrast to Athenian philosophy, democracy, and art. Sparta was also more inland and isolated, which shaped trade and agriculture. Despite these characteristics, Sparta has also shaped the West, especially for notions like sacrifice, duty, and warrior cultures. The Roman writer Plutarch shares his admiration for Sparta and their customs. We can also note Spartan influence in medieval chivalry, Roman military cultures, and most interestingly of all, fascism and National Socialism in the 20th century. I talk more about this in the modern history section. The movie 300, released in 2006, connects the conflict between Greece and Persia to 21st century concerns of terrorism and a clash of civilizations. All of this captures the reality though. While Athens did shape Western civilization, so did Sparta. Also, Sparta did defeat Athens in 404 BC, an event that sadly Ben Shapiro never acknowledged in his book. To him, Jerusalem and Athens are static places that will forever symbolize a set of ideas. But, as I point out, they also symbolize contradictive ideas and competing beliefs. And there's another city that belongs in our discussion about Jerusalem and Athens, one which Ben Shapiro sadly doesn't really acknowledge: Rome, the capital of a republic and an empire. Rome's contribution to Western civilization is strikingly obvious. There is a point to be made about how Rome and the Roman Empire interacted with Athens and Jerusalem. In the case of Judaism and the Roman Empire, there is a clear antagonism, which reaches a climax in the 1st century AD as the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple and put the city of Jerusalem under siege. Roman rule of Judea came with complications and often disaster. For the account of Josephus, we must contend with depictions of murder, cannibalism, torture, and famine. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, I highly suggest the Rest is History's podcast episodes on ancient Judea and Rome, as well as Tom Holland's recent book, Pax. And it isn't just Rome that challenged Jerusalem and Judaism. Athens, well, the Hellenic world did too, with highlights being the Maccabean revolt and the divide between Hellenic and non-Hellenic Jews in Ptolemaic Egypt. To clarify, I will not generalize pre-rabbinic Judaism as entirely against the ideals of Greece and Rome. That is an absurd generalization, and I will not make it. Instead, we should offer a restrained view of the ancient Near East and merely point out that some tensions did exist, both within Judaism and among the Mediterranean populations and peoples who interacted with Judaism. Also, it is fair to expect Ben Shapiro to at least address these complicated histories. He doesn't, but if he did, I'm certain The Right Side of History would be a better book. Now, on to Greece and Rome, better known as the classical world, and how Christianity took form. Whilst Rome incorporated plenty from ancient Greece, including Athens, she also challenged Athenian democracy, particularly in the imperial period from Augustus onwards. By the time of Christianization of Europe, especially the Mediterranean, we witness an emerging strand of apocalyptic thought and doom. The collapse of the western side of the Roman Empire and the rise of Islam accelerates these trends. Historians and theologians refer to this time as late antiquity, which straddles between the classical world and the Middle Ages. Beyond the caliphates and chaos, we also have the Justinian plague in the 6th century AD, as well as several natural disasters across Eurasia. Late antiquity was a dynamic time, but also one of great transformations and changes in society. In Europe and the Middle East, both Christianity and Islam also grew rapidly, but also impacted the identity and culture of these places. Ben Shapiro understandably decries identity politics and the prioritization of the collective over the individual. Hopefully, we can all agree that the last decade has seen academia and media utterly decline with censorship and conformity. Yet, medieval Western history demonstrates how necessary identity and community was, particularly towards the Crusades and chivalric traditions. This truly was a time prior to the Enlightenment, and while the West has always had an individualistic streak, collectivism and group identity was always present. We find this in the case of the Eastern Roman Empire, better known as Byzantium, where the people saw themselves as Romans. In the Alexiad, by the historian and princess Anacomne, our author clearly contextualizes her world through ethnicity and religion, with references to the barbarians, the Scythians, and the Turks, among others. Other medieval chroniclers reflect this too, such as Gunther of Paris, who covered the Fourth Crusade in Constantinople in 1204, but also the Tale of Bygone Years, better known as the Primary Chronicle, from Russia. My point isn't to portray the Middle Ages as woke or overtly obsessed with ethnicity and race, but it was a time where your ethnicity, your language, and your religion mattered. This was the prism as to how outsiders viewed you and how you viewed yourself, and how others in your group did too. identity was powerful, overwhelming even, particularly in Anglo-Saxon England. St. Bede, also known as Bede the Venerable, depicts the torn past between the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes in his ecclesiastical histories. And there is certainly something to be said about how conflict, invasion, and conquest strengthens identity. Identity in the Middle Ages was also expressed through art. A comparative study of the various Gothic cathedrals reveals different regional differences, such as the ones between Rayonnette architecture in northern France and the Venetian styles across the Adriatic. Of course, Gothic cathedral is known for its stained glass, which not only depicts saints and Christ, but also national heroes, kings, and queens. Vernacular literature often employed a common identity and a communal focus, whether it was Beowulf or Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Overall, there is no divorcing the Middle Ages from identity and community. Meanwhile, Ben Shapiro's focus on the Middle Ages is entirely driven by medieval universities and St. Thomas Aquinas. To give credit where it's due, Aquinas and medieval universities such as Bologna and Paris did show a reconciliation between Athens and Jerusalem, between Aristotle and Christianity. When Ben Shapiro writes about this process, he is so strong and sharp, and it is a delight to read. Yet, the wider context and environment Aquinas wrote in deserves more attention, as do events like the Crusades. It's through the Middle Ages that we see a West deeply fixated on who they are through ethnicity, religion, and language. Ben Shapiro's idea of Athens and that of Greece has more in common with neoclassical thinking and the Enlightenment, which viewed Athens as a beacon of reason, rationality, and logic. From the Italian Renaissance onwards, we can see many buildings pop up across Europe and the New World, modelled like the Acropolis in Athens. Many were religious, like St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and St. Paul's in London. There are so many neoclassical civil buildings, such as the White House and the Capitol in the USA. Returning to Europe, the neoclassical style was a preference for museums, palaces, town halls, and parliament buildings. This was all matched by philosophy and writings into the ancient world, with the most well-known one being Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Gibbon, like many of his peers, viewed the ancient world as an age of reason. As opposed to the dreary Middle Ages, there was a glory, greatness within the classical world. Years later, this image of antiquity resulted in genuine geopolitical consequences, with the French Revolution and later, the Greek War for Independence. The European love for antiquity proved effective in chipping away at monarchy and empire. Across the Atlantic, Americans took neoclassical thinking to another level, and essentially founded their nation from these romantic notions. But, as I've established, the classical world is far more than one city-state or single empire. Ben Shapiro's focus on the classical world is entirely about Athens. Shapiro is not Edward Gibbon, granted, but he is falling into the same era by portraying a certain era as incredibly idealistic, rational, and loving of knowledge and inquiry. It's not true though. Athens did produce many wonderful philosophers and thinkers, that is of course the case. Yet, it was an imperfect democracy. There was poverty and corruption, and the victory of Sparta made Athens more autocratic. What Shapiro loves about Athens is ultimately based more on the idea of Athens rather than Athens herself. And unfortunately, I don't think this is enough to save Western civilization from groupthink and far-left ideology, sadly. Regardless, Athens is just one part of the ancient Mediterranean. Many traditions we have today, whether it is chivalry or legal systems, come from the Roman Empire. Some of our artistic and linguistic traditions stem from Germanic, Slavic, and Celtic populations. The language Ben Shapiro and I write in, English, is a good example of Germanic influence. The West was surely not born in Athens, rather took form over centuries from various empires, city-states, and kingdoms. In his book, Ben Shapiro concedes that his beloved Western values were ultimately challenged by the Enlightenment, progressive activists, and communists. Which is a fair point, and one that I share myself. Yet, he doesn't go far enough. He restricts this tension within the West to mere modern history, but it's always been there. You can find this tension in Sparta and Athens, across the Roman Empire, among theologians in the Eastern Roman Empire, and within medieval Britain and France. This is especially the case in modern history, with intellectually diverse movements such as National Socialism, Fascism, Romanticism, the French Revolutionaries, Anarchism, and Communism, who utterly held Ben Shapiro's worldview in contempt. These movements were, however, thoroughly Western, or at least started off that way. I'd argue communism took an Oriental turn in the 20th century with the ascendancy of Maoism in China, the Korean War, the Khmer Rouge, and various activist outlets in South Asia. Ideas, like religions and cultures, evolve and change over time. And despite this, I do not begrudge Ben Shapiro for treasuring Athens and Jerusalem. Rather, my problem is overemphasis and degrading the genuine intellectual diversity that has characterized the West. Rejecting Athens and Jerusalem does not make anyone less Western. This also applies to the religious sphere too. Ben Shapiro's concept of Athens and Jerusalem, and one he stresses throughout his book, often translates into Judeo-Christianity, Judaism, and Christianity. To take a more generous reading, we can add Hellenic religion to this, as it dominated ancient Athens. It's tempting to criticize Ben Shapiro's framing from the perspective of pre-modern religion, but I do not want to repeat my points about diversity in the Mediterranean. So I will shift to modernity, where we encounter so many examples of Westerners incorporating Eastern practices into spirituality and life. Keep in mind, though, that world history in modernity is increasingly globalized, where links between the East and the West, alongside Africa and Oceania, are contested and challenged. When combined with trends of secularism and the many scientific revolutions, there is a noticeable departure from monarchy and clerical approaches to governance. Today, many Westerners have in fact visited the Orient, and some actually live there in the present moment. This exposure to the East is not new. Pre-modern Europe did not live in utter isolation. We can also see many Westerners from the 19th century onwards taking an interest in the Far East, with the religions of China, India, and Japan impacting neo-paganism, esoteric traditions, and occult thinking, but also self-help and business philosophies, while often contextualized in an Orientalist framework. Book Eat, Pray, Love offers an example of a Westerner seeing value in cultures seemingly so divorced from Athens and Jerusalem. There are many Westerners today who consider themselves Buddhist or Hindu, while being an excellent example of the worldliness, curiosity, and intellectual voyeurism of Westerners. It also challenges the dominance of Athens and Jerusalem, at least in the modern West. I think Ben Shapiro himself would have many sharp words for Eat, Pray, Love, or Westerners who are deeply smitten by, say, the Shinto religion. He clearly believes in the merits of Athens and Jerusalem and sees any Westerner wavering from this as tragic. And perhaps I do too. But the truth is, Westerners have wavered from Athens and Jerusalem and have done it so many times. And this is true for ancient, medieval, and modern history. The West is not fundamentally or automatically liberal. Ben Shapiro certainly gives a rosy portrayal of Athens and Jerusalem, which blossoms into an intense appreciation of human rights, individualism, secular law, the scientific method, reason, and self-sufficiency. In this video, I'll admit to nitpicking endlessly about the West and what it means to be Western values, and our history. And sure, there are many flaws to the qualities praised by Shapiro. Take individualism, which can often veer into a direction filled with loneliness, victimization, and depression, similar to a protagonist in a Houellebecq novel. I am personally worried about many Westerners today who feel as if their life has no purpose and no one cares for them. Yet individualism has positives too, which Ben Shapiro is aware of. Believing your life has an inherent value and the decisions you make are important and your own is quite critical to a good life. I certainly see this tenet and strength in both Judaism and Christianity. The West's celebration of agency and the specialness behind every human being is utterly beautiful. That's why I must not go too harsh on the genuine qualities Ben Shapiro raises in The Right Side of History, because there are societies which do not care for the individual, do not use reason, and are utterly dogmatic, like Afghanistan under Taliban rule, or the cults of personalities found in North Korea and Turkmenistan. We must also recognize that this perception of the West being a beacon of human rights, dignity, and freedom is, while flawed in many ways, is very helpful to those living in authoritarian countries. This is shown well in the non-fiction blockbuster Reading Lolita in Tehran, where a group of Persian women find freedom, strength, and even their own desires in Western literature. I'm aware that for many in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, the West represents a hopeful future for their own countries. Under no circumstances will I trample on this or take anything Western for granted. Doing this requires honesty though, and I cannot in good conscience portray the West as something it is not. I want to encourage Westerners to take more care in how we construct and portray ourselves. We ought to consider whether we have lived up to our lofty promises and goals. The three pillars of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, come loaded with obligations and assumptions. And to be frank, the West hasn't always succeeded in following them. Today, Europe is incredibly flawed, with prohibitive speech regulations, serious concerns about social cohesion, growing crime, geopolitical insecurity, and economic catastrophe. Also, as a woman who does believe in free speech and has run Snowy Fictions since 2019, it is much easier to combat censorship and groupthink when there is a genuine consensus that liberty is fundamental to who we are as Westerners. But despite these obvious benefits, it's vital to understand Western civilization and history for what it is. Principles of individualism, dignity, the scientific method, and reason were not always present and often faced great challenges. These concepts are beautiful and necessary, but still face opposition today. I hope to have conveyed their fragile nature and that the West is far more than Athens and Jerusalem. That's enough on the disclaimers front. As a dedicated defender of Western civilization, I truly believe it is possible to see Europe and the successive New World states as what they truly are, while still loving and defending them. Devotion, free from idealization, is desirable. I am happy to join Ben Shapiro in his call for intellectual inquiry, universities free from dogma, and greater appreciation into the histories of Jerusalem and Athens. But I cannot endorse the historiography present in his thesis or his construction of the past. I hope my video conveyed these points well, and at the very least, caused a deeper introspection as to what it means to truly be Western. But back to you. What are your thoughts on Ben Shapiro's thesis? Was the West founded on Athens and Jerusalem? Do you have any ideas or opinions on Western civilization? Comment below. I'd love to read your thoughts and start a discussion. Subscribe for frequent videos on history, literature, and culture. I also have a mailing list and a blog, all linked below. Thank you for watching, and I'll certainly see you soon.